Hello and welcome to this weekend's celebration of the Feast of the Ascension. The reflection I'm giving today is entitled The Ascension of Victory Parade. I'd like to challenge you to think about this feast in a way perhaps that you've not looked at it before, but by way of entering into this mystery of the Ascension, I want to turn back, first of all, to a retreat I recently returned from. It was put on by Acts 29, a group based out of Detroit, Michigan. It was a wonderful experience for us. And in part, the retreat master, Father John, in one of his talks, he shared that he came from a very pro-military family, that a number of people in his family had served in the military. And in particular, he highlighted, I believe it was his grandfather, who was a decorated war hero of World War II. And I think he either grew up with his grandfather in his home or at least in close proximity, that he had a lot of opportunities to spend with him. And so he says that was kind of a formative experience of his childhood, hearing about stories of World War II and sort of seeing that as a measure of our country at its greatest. There's a reason, I think, why we refer to that generation who went through World War II as the Great Generation, because perhaps in contrast to what we see today with the conflict and division of our country, the nation was fairly united in this monumental task, a global war, a war that I think a lot of people probably saw as an apocalyptic kind of war to end all wars, the good versus evil. We had Adolf Hitler. We had the events of Pearl Harbor. We had the death camps. We had a lot of atrocities and evil dictators on display. And we entered into that war committed to victory, that virtually no family in America could say they didn't have somebody serving in a military branch, or they were working in factories that had been converted over for military use, or they were stepping into the workforce to try and keep the local economy going, and people were planting victory gardens, and people were doing without goods and services for the sake of winning a victory. Everybody was contributing something in the form of blood, sweat, and tears to win this victory, and it spanned over years and years. And you can think of all these difficult battles, the storming of Normandy and Iwo Jima and Midway, and what was going on in other parts of the world, in North Africa, in the Soviet Union, and many people losing their lives. I think the estimate is over 20 million people who died as a result of the war. Maybe it's higher than that, but sadly, at the end of it, not hardly anyone could say they didn't lose somebody in their family to the war, or their neighbor did, somebody they knew. So that the war brought with it a great sense of investment and emotional cost, and costs in other ways as well. And so when that war finally came to an end, it was a great celebration. As he was telling these stories, a lot of old classic photos from Time Life were rolling through my head, and I love to watch History Channel, so I've seen hours and hours of war footage, and even one of my master's degrees is really essentially on World War II, on the Catholic martyrs who died in concentration camps. And so I read for 2 years, probably several hundred books from that era in history. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of it, even though I didn't live through it on my own. But to take in all that context of the war, you can't really appreciate the kind of joyful celebration that takes place unless you also remember the pain and the cost that was involved. But in the end, you imagine old photos of sailors tossing their hats in the air, or people dancing and drinking and singing and gathering together all across the country, finally with the idea that the war had come to an end and we could return to a sense of peace. They didn't, as Father John put it, just open the newspaper one day and say, oh, looks like rain showers this afternoon, and looks like the Yankees won their game last night, and oh, by the way, World War II's over. Wonder what's on page 3. They didn't do that. It was a massive outcome. Okay, I hope I've made my point very, very clear. But this is to say, in contrast to that, why don't we have something similar in our response when we think of the kind of feast days we celebrate at this time of the year during the Easter season and beyond, the Ascension being one of those? This story came to mind for me because as great as that celebration must have been at the end of World War II, it should be greater knowing that the outcome of the great spiritual war between the greatest enemy of humanity and Jesus Christ being over should raise a similar response of joy, but it doesn't. In fact, I shared at Mass, if I went out on the street and found 100 Catholics and told them to define for me the Ascension or explain to me what this feast is about, I'm not at all confident that a significant percentage of them could even define what it is. If you're not familiar, by the way, it is in fact celebrating the day in which the time of Jesus being with his disciples, teaching them after his resurrection had come to an end, a 40-day period, and he ascends into heaven. He goes up to heaven to open up the gates of heaven for the rest of us. Because up to that point, only God and the angels are in heaven. Even the most righteous of those in the Old Testament who are mentioned, they're not there. Why? Because the wages of sin are death, and because, as Revelation points out, only that which is perfected may enter the gates of heaven. Jesus is the only qualified candidate to make that first move. It's a very significant thing because only after this event do we have hope of heaven in the afterlife. That's the event itself. But we should be shooting off bottle rockets and fireworks and dancing in the streets, but we don't. Why? Because I don't think we have a good sense of what the war was about and the cost of the war. If we don't know the cost, it's hard to get excited about the outcome. And so by way of that, Father John, I think, pointed out what he meditates on from time to time, to imagine if that sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross never happened, what we could expect to see at the end of our death. He imagined a kind of a scene in a courtroom in which, I can't come up with his exact words, but essentially it's where the judge looks at you and says, you know, the wages of sin are death. I'm looking at your case here. I'm sorry, I can't do anything for you. And the judge just gets up and walks out of the room, and the door closes and you hear it slam and the lights go out, and you realize for a second you're all alone. And this is your fate. And then you hear a laugh, and it's Satan. That was our state as humans. We were bound by the strong man. We were slaves to sin and death. And we had no hope. It was a dismal thing, the idea of death at that time. So first of all, maybe to get a sense of gratitude that doesn't have to be our fate. If you imagine yourself in that scene, you want to scream out and say, Lord, save me. I don't want this to be my fate. Thankfully, he did something about it. And it reminds me, in one particular moment, Father John showed a scene of some of the troops that were storming Omaha Beach on D-Day. I believe that's what the photo was. It was a close-up shot of 6 or 8 or 10 soldiers springing out of a troop transport. They were about hip deep in ocean water. They were racing for the beachhead. I imagine bullets were landing all around them. It was an incredible photo, though. You could see close-up of the faces. You could see exhaustion, maybe a little sign of seasickness, perhaps a little bit of anxiety, but also some determination and focus. And if I recall correctly, I think over 60% of the troops who initially landed on that beachhead were gunned down by gun placements high above. So the cost of taking that beachhead were immense. But he just framed that moment without us knowing the fate of those in the photo. Perhaps a number of them lost their life in that moment. And he asked a very direct and simple question. Why are they there? It's kind of an obvious answer. They weren't there for a beach vacation. They weren't there on a fishing trip. They were there for one purpose. The purpose was to fight. If you want to be more blunt, they came there to kill. They came to kill the enemy and to try to bring a swift end to the war. But let's leave it at that basic observation. They were there to fight. And next to that photo, he put up a photo of a Christmas card, basically a classic Hallmark Christmas card image of Mary and Joseph hugging, and they have the baby Jesus in their arms, and you can see a bit of the manger in the background. And he asked the question again of the child Jesus, why is he there? And I think I won't forget his answer because it was deep wisdom. He said, if you don't give the same answer, that is that he's there to fight, then you don't understand Christmas. It's nice that we get together, we have joyful thoughts, we exchange gifts, we reconnect with family. All those things are beautiful and important. But at the heart of the mystery of the incarnation, that mystery of the Word becoming flesh, the greatest miracle God ever performed, is the reality that he came there to fight. That little baby, in fact, is an infant soldier waiting to grow up, but he came to do battle with our enemy on our behalf. Thanks be to God, so that we don't have to have that horrific fate of being left in the dark alone with the enemy. He came to destroy the strong man, to break those bonds of sin and death for us so that we might hope for something else in the afterlife. An image that comes to mind for me is, imagine every human being who ever lived, past, present, and future, forming some big line, just almost an endless line. You can't see the end of it. And each person has in their hand a paper summarizing their life, all the offenses they ever committed, every sin. And in the other hand is their sentence. This is the corresponding punishment for your choices. And each one of us is looking it over with a heavy, heavy heart, knowing we could never bear this cost. We're not going to be able to do this. How can we survive? And with that same heavy heart, we get up to the front of the line where Jesus is, and he just takes the paper out of each one of our hands and says, I'll take this for you. I'll take it on myself. You go on ahead. And the next person comes and he says, I'll take that too. I'll take that too. And the next one and the next. He took the sin of the entire human race and put it on his shoulders. The entirety of the punishment due for that sin, he put on his shoulders like a great warrior. And in the words of one ancient Christian, as I mentioned prior to Holy Week, he was a great gladiator in that moment. He came to fight in a way that true champions do. That even in front of a hostile crowd, he didn't choose his opponent. He said, you choose my opponent. Bring your worst. Okay, so it's crucifixion on the cross, the worst death you can think of. I accept. The worst enemy, Satan, I accept. And in the agony of the garden, as he sweat blood, he took on the weight of the sin of the entire human race and went into the arena. And he was victorious. The way Father John describes it, I thought I was familiar with all of the ancient images of Jesus in that time. One of the ones that I was familiar with as someone who loves fishing is Jesus being described as the bait on the hook, with God the Father trolling, trying to draw Satan in, a big largemouth bass with Jesus as the bait to win the victory. But he shared an image I've never heard before. He said, imagine an image of Jesus as the ultimate ambush predator. An ambush predator, if you're not familiar, is normally in the reptilian family. It's a camouflaged creature very often who is very skilled at remaining still and who waits for its food source, its prey, to come within striking range, and it continues to remain still like a serpent hidden in the shrubs, and then all of a sudden, wham! It strikes, and the prey is killed and eaten. Or a crocodile, it sinks low in a muddy, swamp and waits for a gazelle to come up to get a drink, and all of a sudden, wham! This is Jesus on the cross, according to this Christian, the ultimate ambush predator, now still on the cross, waiting for Satan to make his move, and then he strikes and defeats him. Abbot Jeremy Driscoll, who's here locally in Mount Angel, gave an additional image that I want to put with that I found very beautiful. He said, imagine a car racing down the highway at high speed, and suddenly you put on your emergency brake. When a vehicle goes from high speed to zero, suddenly it just doesn't stop smoothly. When it starts to stop, you lurch forward in your seatbelt, and then the vehicle rolls backwards, and then finally you come to rest. That's just the laws of physics at play, and the shock absorbers and everything taking that impact. He said, imagine that of Jesus on the cross, that in that moment of crucifixion, he leans forward and he grabs all of future humanity, and he rolls backwards and he grabs all of humanity that came before him, and then he comes to rest in the present moment. He takes us all in with that act of sacrifice, and then he waits in ambush for Satan, and he wins the victory. That is World War II. That is the Victory Day. A lot of Christians mistakenly look at a crucifix and say, that's the picture of defeat. Yes, it's sacrificial love, but that's the defeat Jesus incurred so that on Easter he could gain the victory. They tend to think because of the resurrection, that's when the victory was won. But it's pointed out by many, no, the victory was won on the cross on Good Friday. What happened on Easter is the equivalent of an Olympic athlete, after triumphing over his opponents, stepping onto the podium to receive his or her gold medal. And the Ascension, the feast we celebrate today, might be akin to that athlete heading home after the games to their hometown for a victory parade. If you've ever seen the aftermath of a Super Bowl victory or a World Series victory, when the team comes home to their hometown in case they won the championship in an away game, they have a great celebration in the streets regarding that triumph. That's what Jesus is doing, because on the cross, he won victory over sin and over Satan. And while in the tomb, he descended to the dead, the only one who could freely move among the dead to free the captives. And there he won victory over death, releasing the captives, and then ultimately rose himself. And Ascension is the victory parade. In ancient Rome, when they gained great victories, the various Roman legions, they had the right to go into Rome in a triumph. That's actually the name of the victory parade, often with Caesar at the front and the victorious general in the leading chariots and the troops who played a part in that victory. Then come the prisoners of war, and finally in a cage would come the defeated general of the foes to be ridiculed and tortured and put to death before the crowd. That is Satan. He is now caged and defeated because of what Jesus did. But ultimately that parade is a long one. We hope to be a part of that as it comes our turn to pass away from this life and enter into paradise. We want to be a part of that, part of the troops who fought the fight. But he had to go first to open that gate. And because of that, we can look forward to possible life in heaven if we are faithful and true to the end, if we fight the good fight to the finish. For that alone, we should have a deeper gratitude. We should try to put that in proper perspective this week as we pray. That should cause you to throw your hat up in the air and shout, hallelujah. Thanks be to God. We're on the winning team. It's very tempting at times when we look at the situation of the world, when we look at the division in our country, when we look at the conflicts and the setbacks and all the problems related to our politics and our economy and COVID-19, and feel like we're losing. In fact, you can see on display the influence of the church seems to be in decline, and it's true. We have to acknowledge that, but we also must understand and acknowledge and accept by faith that we're on the winning side We know how the story ends from Revelation. So have confidence in that. Have confidence in a victor and be grateful that we have a soldier who came to fight for us, who won the victory. I hope you have a blessed week this week. Thanks be to God that Jesus is our representative who won victory for us. Let's be victorious in him. Tune in next week for another reflection. God bless you all.